If there is one thing you can say about human beings, it's that we can't leave well enough alone. It's not enough for us to just have one successful idea. We have to develop it, iterate it, and evolve it, and push it to its absolute furthest extents. And of course, the end results are often extremely cursed. And in honour of that, in honour of the fact that humans are incapable of just stopping while we're ahead, we're going to take a look today at two Starship classes that are really the final legacy of the Ukazaki Bureau and the Daedalus class. We're going to be looking at the descendants of the Daedalus, and these are the Moskva and the Dragon. So, just to make absolutely clear, I am not going to be reading off of Starfleet Museum verbatim because, well, you should go read Starfleet Museum yourself, it's fantastic stuff. But what I will be doing is essentially just meshing it into my own headcanon, my own universe. The reason I am doing it is because I believe that there is space for both the Enterprise continuity and Ukazaki's continuity. You just shift one of them earlier. Without any further ado then, let's get right into it. I suppose the first thing I should explain is who developed these ships. Well, Daedalus and all of its ancestors were developed by the Masao Ukazaki Bureau. Who were the Ukazaki Bureau? Well, they were founded by a Dr. Masao Ukazaki in 2064. Dr. Ukazaki was a partner of Dr. Cochrane. He was involved in the warp drive program. Now, he was of a very different mindset of Dr. Cochrane. Zephram Cochrane, when he successfully launched the Phoenix and demonstrated it, decided immediately that the next thing he wanted to do was make it better, was improve on it, get it faster. And that was basically Dr. Cochrane's approach for the rest of his career. He wasn't interested in sort of refining designs as he was pushing things even further, even more powerful, even faster. That was what Cochrane was interested in. Dr. Ukazaki had a very different idea. His idea was to manufacture warp ships for everyone, to make them as viable as possible and as producible as possible. He wanted humanity to reap the benefits of this technology, to uplift humanity out of the ashes of the Third World War and propel humanity into a brighter future in the stars. So Ukazaki was about producing warp ships at large scale in volume. So he was never interested so much in pushing technological boundaries, so much as he was interested in producing vessels on a mass scale. And coincidentally, this was also very good business. And in many ways, he was actually taking examples from history as well. He was looking back at the history of his own country. Post-war Japan had an incredible recovery in the 20th century, largely because of investments into technology and manufacturing that took Japan from being an absolute economic basket case to one of the major economic players of the world. So, before we get to the final infamous chapters of the Ukazaki Design Bureau, we should first talk about the design timeline of the Bureau. So, the first design by the Ukazaki Bureau is in 2070, and that is the Cretchet class. I've talked about this before in the Daedalus class video. This essentially has a reactor bulb at the back, and then the warp nacelles at the fore. Now, this changes when we get to the Amarillo class and we start to see the more conventional design qualities of the warp nacelles being placed at the back and habitation placed at the fore, because reactors are getting extremely powerful and radioactive at this point. Then we get to 2100 and the Ukazaki Bureau breaks Warp 2 with the Comet class, although this is really beginning to strain the technology. But with the Comet class you can begin to see the emergence of that Daedalus style of design, i.e. two distinct hull sections, an engineering and habitation section, divided into essentially a cylinder and a sphere. Then in 2115 they launched the Daedalus class. Now this is an absolutely huge hit and a very widely produced vessel. at first probably capable of about warp 2.5, would eventually be able to push up to 3. This is where we start to get to some complications in the story of the Ukazaki Bureau. The sailing is less smooth from here on out, because in 2117, Zephram Cochrane creates the Warp 5 complex. Now, initially, this is in cooperation with Masao Ukazaki. He has made very clear to Dr. Ukazaki that the developments made at the Warp 5 complex will also be shared with Ukazaki's company, and so they can begin mass producing these, Warp 5 ships at the same time as the Warp 5 complex. He doesn't want there to be a spirit of competition. However, unfortunately, very soon after this, Dr. Cochrane will disappear while testing the Bonaventure prototype out of Alpha Centauri. And there then becomes a whole drama between the Warp 5 program and the Ukazaki Bureau. In 2130, the Ukazaki Bureau begins development for the Daedalus' successor, that is the Moskva. However, in 2135, the NX Alpha breaks Warp 2. And then in 2137, the NX Delta breaks Warp 3. And then in 2146, the USS Franklin will break Warp 4. Now, this is bad news for Moskva, because originally when Moskva was going to be introduced, it was going to be extremely advanced. It was going to be a highly efficient Warp 3 rated fusion engine. However, it was very suddenly outmoded, and Starfleet would basically shut down the production of the Moskva class. They weren't interested in it anymore because they now had these new antimatter powered ships. Now, Ukazaki had actually planned for this because Moskva was going to have a modular core. However, there was a problem, and that was that the Warp 5 program refused initially to hand over the new warp cores to make it a Warp 5 ship. And so for a good long while, the Moskva, what few Moskvas were produced, were basically ignored and were waiting to be scrapped. That was until Earth underwent what we would describe as a significant emotional event in the form of the Romulan Earth War. Now, I've just teased you with a little bit of Romulan Earth War, and we will get there. But first, we have to go into the design of the Moskva, and critically, we have to ask, what's happening to our spaceballs? You see, you can see the inherent design logic going from the Cretchet all the way to the Daedalus. It's the same design principles, really, in that we've got our sphere sections, we've got spaceballs. But suddenly, with the Moskva class, we're starting to move away from spaceballs. So what's going on there? Okay. So the reason that older ships had sphere sections was because they needed to be more voluminous, and this is because they had bigger, less efficient reactors, and this meant that they had to go on longer voyages and would also consume larger proportions of fuel. It's also worth pointing out that in this early period of warp drive, speed and geometry were less of a concern because your reactors weren't powerful enough to do that anyway, so it became less of an issue. And then also, because actually these reactors have relatively low energy output, heat is also less of a concern. However, as power plants improve and become more efficient and more compact, sphere sections become less useful and more detrimental, because they have, relatively speaking, a small surface area, and also they have a high profile, which means that they're not great for warp geometry. And so we start to move towards the widespread adoption of saucer sections because they have two main benefits. They are better at radiating heat because they have a larger surface area in proportion to their overall volume, and they also have a lower profile. Now, of course, there's a balance. You don't want to make your saucer section paper thin. But in this time period, we can really see that transition away from the sphere section and more concertedly towards the saucer section. The main reason that a lot of Warp 5 ships adopted the saucer section earlier is, of course, because they were running on antimatter engines with higher energy output and more heat that required radiating away. So, with that in mind, let's now talk about the Moskva specifically. So, the Moskva has a more compact Warp 3 engine than the Daedalus class when it initially launches, and that is packed into a bustle at the back of the engineering hull. And this is deliberate because it allows it modularity. It's going to be really easy to just remove this engine and put in a Warp 5 engine when the time comes. Not to mention that also in terms of maintenance, this is also very, very easy, because if the engine needs maintenance, it doesn't need the whole ship disassembling. You can just unplug the bustle, add in a new one with another engine while you fix up the other engine, similar to how a lot of tanks operate these days. So in many ways it is a much more future-proofed design than the Daedalus, although the Daedalus was still, relatively speaking, more modular. But the Moskva really took that to the technological limits. The other thing to notice about the Moskva is that unlike the Daedalus, which was mostly a bit of a patrol vessel, whereas the Moskva was more intended to serve as a expeditionary ship, capable of competing with other antimatter powered designs like the Intrepid type. One of the ways in which you can actually see that is that it has a new design of nacelle compared to the Daedalus, a nacelle type that is actually not that different from those that we see on the Warp Delta, a sort of Spitzer type nacelle with a very pointed Bussard cone. And that is no coincidence, because they're attempting to do the same thing. So the Moskva is much more modular than the Daedalus class, and it's also incredibly well armed. We have 8 lasers mounted across the hull. These are essentially your point defense weapons. These are for shooting down incoming projectiles, because of course shields are not yet a thing. You then have 2 high energy laser cannons mounted in the bow. These are very, very long range and very powerful. They are a lot longer range than a phase cannon. These are very, very good weapons, especially against unshielded opponents. They can burn through armor very quickly, and as I say, they have a very good range. They also have 2 missile tubes. Now, unlike the Daedalus, which was retrofitted with large-scale, essentially ballistic missile tubes, the Moskva mounts its missiles in the same sort of pattern as other Starfleet ships, with forward-facing torpedo tubes, and these are the same kind of spatial torpedo models as we'll see on ships like the NX and Intrepid type, essentially advanced guided missiles, capable of executing evasive maneuvers to targets. The only issue with the Moskva's armament is that it only carried 36 of these missiles, and so didn't necessarily have much combat endurance, but it wasn't really meant to be. Its main weapons are the laser cannons, and those will allow it to engage enemies out to a very far range. The spatial torpedoes are in many ways acting in support of that. So, when it came to the Romulan War, unfortunately, because the Moskva program was shut down prematurely, there weren't too many of these ships around. However, where they were deployed, they did serve as very effective snipers. With these high-power lasers, they were able to reach out far beyond the range of the NX and other phase cannon-equipped vessels, and hit the enemy with their energy weapons well before anyone else's energy weapons were even close to being in range. So they were very, very good. The only issue with the Moskva class was that it was not well armoured. It didn't fare well at close range. But it was often able to engage with lasers well before the Romulans can close. Another issue that the Moskva did have was that it did suffer from overheating. These lasers were very powerful, and with sustained fire would overheat the ship and force it to shut down. So it could not fire away with these laser cannons indefinitely. It would at some point have to break its fire. It's also worth mentioning that some Romulan vessels were much better protected against lasers, with ships like the Cabbage and Clavicle actually being very, very good at absorbing lasers. The Cabbage essentially has that large bell on the top of the ship, and that is very good at dispersing lasers across the armor. And additionally, with the Clavicle, it's got a very low profile and can very easily maneuver so that the damage of the laser is again spread across a wide area. But equally, there were still plenty of ships that the Moskva could do damage on, and critically, it was often best used when it wasn't seen. So you distract the Romulans with a formation to its front, maybe some Daedaluses, and they'd launch missiles, and the Romulans would go, oh yay, we can have a missile duel. The Moskva then maneuvers into the flank of the Romulans and hits their vulnerable side quarters, generally targeting their engines and power systems. And at that, it was very efficient. It was also very good, therefore, in chasing retreating enemies. Because, of course, in order to retreat, you'd have to turn your vulnerable rear in order to get away from the enemy. So, at that point, the Moskva was very capable of giving the Romulans a good kick up the arse, so to speak. So, with the performance of the Moskva in the Romulan War, there became a renewed interest in developing a successor to this class. Originally, of course, the Moskva was just going to be thrown in the trash along with all the other Ukazaki designs in place of more modern antimatter powered designs. But because of the successes of the Moskva, the Ukazaki Bureau got another chance. And with that second chance, they developed the Dragon class. This is basically taking the Moskva and putting it on fucking steroids. This began development at the outbreak of war, and it was basically to double down on the successes of the Moskva and compete with the Yorktown class, which was the other battleship under development. As I previously mentioned, the Moskva did very well with its 2 laser cannons, and so what the Ukazaki Bureau did is give it not 4, not 8, but 9 laser cannons. So, to say that this ship ran hot would be perhaps the biggest understatements of history. This thing was incredibly hot. Now, there's things you can do to alleviate that kind of heat buildup. You can use various forms of stagger fire. But the end result is that it would be almost suicidal to fire all 8 of your forward laser cannons at the same time. The 9th laser cannon is mounted at the back of the neck facing aft. The Dragon also mounts 6 torpedo tubes, 4 of them facing forward and 2 facing aft. It has no point defense lasers and instead is completely reliant on early shielding and interceptor torpedoes. And when I say early shielding, I mean early shielding, because the ship's already running hot, and now they also want to run deflector shields off of that same power plant. Unsurprisingly, this design lost out to the Yorktown class, and it's worth pointing out that the Yorktown only saw about 4 ships launched during the last months of the Romulan War anyway, and they weren't involved in the Battle of Cheron. They were instead deployed to the main front lines while Archer led his task force into Romulan space. Even after the Romulan War, this design was not revived because it was simply too specialized, and it put all its eggs into one basket, that basket being laser cannons. It was an obviously flawed failure of a design and arguably missed the key points of its 2 predecessors, the Daedalus and the Moskva. Those ships were extraordinarily modular, and the Dragon really wasn't. The Dragon was built to do one thing and one thing only, and what it was built to do was very stupid. Those of you who know Battletech will probably compare this to something like, oh, I don't know, a Nova mech. Not the Nova class, there's a mech called the Nova. That's the Romulan War, and that was really the Ukazaki Bureau's final hurrah, with the Daedalus taking center stage, basically being the defining ship of the war, really. Fortunately, after the war, they did start to make more sensible decisions than the Dragon. They suddenly faced a huge amount of competition and a huge amount of new technologies coming in from the new Federation members that meant that a lot of their designs were just completely outmoded. And so they would eventually be folded into the Warp 5 design program and eventually, of course, the Utopia Planitia yards and everything. After the war, they issued refits to the Daedalus and Moskva class. They also developed the Gagarin class, which basically took the semi-saucer, or shall we call it burger section of the Moskva class, and incorporated it onto a very sleek and modern looking hull. The Gagarin class was a pure science vessel and nothing more, but it was a very good early explorer and early science vessel for Starfleet, and would really see out the 22nd century. It also continued to manufacture large-scale civilian designs in the form of ships like the Ocean class, and really that was what Dr. Ukazaki had been all about. Dr. Ukazaki had always been very interested not so much on building the most advanced ships, and certainly not in building warships, but in building ships that could be mass-produced, that would benefit all of humanity, and allow us to pursue that dream of travelling to the stars. So, do these two ships, these two cursed suns, do they really deserve their reputation? Well, the Moskva, I think, absolutely not. In fact, in many ways, the Ukazaki Moskva very much redeems the name, which currently sits in a very bad place. Putting aside the laser cannons and its service during the Romulan War, what the Moskva really did was innovate in how you build starships. And it's quite telling that that particular aspect, that modularity, and what we see with the ships of the early Federation is that begins to take hold very quickly. It's a very good, very efficient, and very economical way of producing starships on large scale. And that is, I think, the main lesson of the Moskva class. It's not necessarily any of its weapons or engines, it's how the thing was put together, and arguably it was vital in shaping how future starships would be designed. Whereas you compare it to ships like the NX classes, which very much had these very monolithic hulls and were very difficult to actually modify quickly. And again, if you wanted to get the engine out of the NX class, you had to basically rip the thing apart. Whereas, as I said before, that bustle design has its problems. Of course, your engine is there more vulnerable, but it does allow for quicker maintenance, quicker turnaround, and ease of production. And arguably that's perhaps why we will then later see Starfleet get very keen on the idea of ejectable warp cores. Much like with the Moskva, where you only had to pull out the bustle, with the ejectable warp core, you only have to pull the thing out, load in a new one, and your ship's ready to roll again. So that's the main lesson of the Moskva. It innovated in how starships could be built. The Dragon absolutely deserves its reputation. It is an example of the dangers of taking things to their absolute extremes. In many ways, it's a very interesting ship simply because of how unapologetic it is about what it is doing. But it's also a very good reminder about why you shouldn't do it. Here's the thing. History can often look like there's an obvious progression of things. We look back now at things like your 5-turreted tanks or twin Mustangs, and we think, that was silly. That was absolutely silly. But the thing is that at the time, these aren't stupid ideas. These are just ideas. There's that famous statement, there's no such thing as a stupid idea. Now, there is such a thing as a stupid idea, but we don't know that it's going to be necessarily a stupid idea until we try it. You can dismiss something as a stupid idea, and particularly if it has been tried before and you can see that it's a stupid idea, absolutely say it's a stupid idea, don't do it. But if it's a completely new idea, well, maybe don't just dismiss it out of hand, try it, and then when it inevitably does fail, you can say, well, I told you so, it's a stupid idea. But now we know. Those lessons have been learned. So these ships are really vital stepping stones. They are vital learning experiences about what works and what doesn't. And while future generations will always look back on the things that we today are designing and developing and laugh hysterically, don't think they won't. Just as we have laughed at the twin Mustang and the A1E1 Independent, don't go thinking that, they won't look back on things that we had built and say that was silly. because they absolutely will. But we can be safe in the knowledge that our mistakes and our embarrassment is what allowed them to have the technology that they now take for granted. And that ultimately is the real lesson of the Okazaki Bureau and its varied and rich history of design. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarchs, Tully DT, David Reeves, Rella, and Macross Schaffer. My loyal commanders, Philip Ty, Bird Monster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Narrator, Nathaniel Mead, Adam Bowman, Gabe Logan, DM Tribal Typhoon, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Joe G, You Don't Know Trek, and Scotty O. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Okokatum Questo, John Nicole, Athletes Collection, Tobias Klein, Greg Martin, Mazarine, Bird of Play D3, Jamal Soto, and Khan the Skektal Overlord. And I thank all my sub-lieutenants. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.